In the history of conflict, death usually wears a uniform. It marches with the rumble of artillery, dives from bombers screaming across the sky, and crushes with the unstoppable weight of tanks. When a soldier sees the enemy coming, the choice is simple: run or hide. But in the streets of Harlem in 1943, death did not appear as a soldier, a monster, or a machine. It came wrapped in innocence. It wore braids and pedaled a bicycle. She was just 14. Her name was Freddie Oversteegen. Freddie rode through the shadows of the afternoon, her dark braids swinging like pendulums. To the German sentries she was invisible, a child running errands for her mother. They waved her through checkpoints, smiled at her, never thinking twice about the wicker basket perched on her handlebars. That basket held a secret that would make their smiles a last expression. Beneath schoolbooks and bread, a Von Browning pistol rested, loaded and ready. And Freddie knew exactly how to use it. She wasn't returning home to play. She was hunting. To understand Freddie, one cannot start with the gun. One must start with hunger. The hunger for justice, for survival, for dignity in a world gone mad. Freddie Oversteegen was born in September 1925, in the village of Schotten, near Harlem. This wasn't the Holland of postcards, tulips and canals idealized by tourists. Freddie's childhood was carved from grit and scarcity. Her family lived aboard a canal barge that smelled of stagnation, mildew, and the despair of a father who dreamed songs but could not feed his children. The strength in Freddie's veins came from her mother, Trijen Jan Oversteegen, a woman of granite resolve, a communist at a time when such convictions made enemies. Politics for Trijen wasn't a philosophy, it was survival. Her barge harbored refugees fleeing persecution from Lithuania. Young Freddie and her sister Truus absorbed their first lesson in resistance long before school taught them letters. When the barge failed as a home, the family was forced into a cramped Harlem apartment, a space where straw mattresses became beds and second-hand clothing was a daily uniform. Despite the scarcity, Trijen insisted on dignity. She enrolled the girls in the Dutch Youth Federation. While others learned to sew, Freddie and Truus learned to care for children orphaned by distant wars, learning early that men with power could devastate innocent lives. Then, on May 10, 1940, the world changed. The German army descended upon the Netherlands, swift and relentless. Rotterdam's city center burned under Luftwaffe bombers, the Dutch army crumbled, and surrender came in 5 days. Swastikas replaced the nation's flags. Jackboots became the rhythm of the streets. Ordinary people ducked, hid, waited for someone else to save them. But the Overstegens did not wait. They acted. It began quietly. The family printed pamphlets against the occupiers in their living room, the clattering press forcing them to post lookouts outside. Freddie, at 14, and Truus, 16, ran messages, pasted warning posters over German propaganda, and became invisible threats. At first, the Germans thought it a nuisance. Children did not frighten them. That illusion ended in 1941 when Frans van der Veen, commander of the Harlem Council of Resistance, came knocking. He knew of the girls' early actions but came with a new proposition. He needed couriers who could vanish through the city, scouts for German positions, fighters. He asked the question that would steal their childhood forever: would they learn to use weapons? Truus, pragmatic and wary, asked what many children might ask: would they have to kill? Van der Veen answered honestly, yes, but only the fascists, the collaborators, those responsible for bloodshed. Their mother, Trijen, faced a brutal choice: keep her children safe or arm them to fight evil. She chose courage. She granted permission with a single instruction that would haunt Freddie for the rest of her life: always stay human. Whatever you do, never lose yourself. Training began in secret. A hidden potato shed became their school. In the dim, musty light, Freddie held a revolver for the first time. It was alien, heavy, unforgiving. She learned to aim, to fire, to handle the recoil. She mastered grenades, explosives, and sabotage, all while peers worried about school dances or boys. The first mission wasn't murder, it was fire. Freddie and Truus dressed as carefree girls, lured guards with charm and laughter, while resistance fighters set warehouses ablaze. When the fires were lit, the sisters vanished into the night, hearts racing, the taste of danger thrilling. Yet killing would come. The resistance needed liquidators. Targets weren't men in uniform. They were men sending innocents to camps, hunting Jews, betraying their neighbors. Freddie's first real kill came on a gray, cold street, the weight of the gun in her basket heavier than her own fear. She pulled the trigger. A human life ended by a child's hand. Instantly, the simplicity of innocence shattered. Afterward, adrenaline faded. Horror remained. Freddie had crossed a line no child should ever know. And yet, the war demanded it. The streets, the woods, the occupied cities, they needed her courage, her cunning, her willingness to risk herself. By the time she pedaled home that day, Freddie Oversteegen was no longer a girl with braids. She was a soldier of the shadows, a ghost among the living. The streets of Harlem were no longer just lanes and canals, they were battlefields hidden in plain sight. Freddie and Truus had learned that war doesn't announce itself. It doesn't roar in a theater or parade in uniforms. It comes silently, in whispers and footsteps, in the casual glance of a child that no one notices. Every day was a balancing act between life and death, invisibility and exposure. After their first fire mission, the sisters began to understand the stakes of their new existence. The Council of Resistance wasn't a classroom, it was a crucible. Every message carried, every poster pasted, every minor sabotage operation carried the weight of potential death. Yet even as danger surrounded them, Freddie found a strange rhythm in it, a focus that erased the fears that might otherwise crush a normal child. She had a talent for precision, calm in moments when adults faltered. Her fingers steadied as she loaded a gun, her breath measured as she planted explosives. And each success brought both pride and guilt, the thrill of striking the enemy tempered by the knowledge that blood had been spilled. By 1943, the sisters' circle expanded. A new member joined, Hannie Schaft. She was older than Freddie and Truus, a fiery law student with hair the color of copper fire. She was brilliant, daring, and impossibly fearless. Hannie had refused to sign a loyalty oath to the Nazis, choosing instead to fight from the shadows. Her intellect was a weapon, her charisma a shield. The sisters gravitated toward her immediately. Together they formed a triad of resistance. Freddie, Truus, and Hannie, the three musketeers of the Dutch underground. Hannie brought strategy, but also a daring that pushed the sisters to the edge of recklessness. Her presence changed the nature of their operations. No longer was sabotage limited to fires or stolen messages. The trio began targeting collaborators, those who betrayed neighbors for personal gain or Nazi favor. They learned to blend innocence with deception, to smile when surrounded by danger, to appear vulnerable while carrying lethal intent. It was a psychological warfare, one that required more than courage. It demanded complete control over their own emotions, the suppression of instinctual fear. The concept of the honey trap emerged during this period. The Germans underestimated young women, assuming they were harmless, naive, or in pursuit of flirtation. Freddie and Truus learned to weaponize that underestimation. Bars and taverns became hunting grounds. The sisters would sit alone, appearing shy, fragile, or lonely. German officers, bored or arrogant, approached. And then, like a predator, Freddie or Truus would guide the man away from the safety of the public eye, often into the shadowy embrace of the city's forests. Sometimes ambushes awaited. Other times the girls acted alone. Their first solo assassination was a test of nerve and morality. Freddie's target was a man responsible for sending families to death camps. She memorized his schedule, studied his habits, and waited. The streets were gray and wet, the air sharp with winter's bite. Freddie pedaled her bicycle toward the target, the basket concealing her gun. She imagined every scenario, every reaction, every possible outcome. And yet, when the moment arrived, instinct took over. One pull of the trigger ended a human life. The aftermath was immediate and devastating internally. Freddie's mind recoiled even as the world outside demanded continued action. She had obeyed the rules of resistance, the orders of survival, but the humanity her mother had instilled remained intact. The terror, guilt, and adrenaline mixed into a toxic stew that would haunt her dreams for decades. She rode away from the body, hands shaking, stomach churning, yet alive. Alive to do it again if the city required. The sisters' work wasn't confined to killings. They were also saviors. Dutch Jews faced systematic deportation. Families were torn from homes and sent east. Freddie and Truus began smuggling children from holding centers, moving them from city to countryside, hiding them in barns, attics, and secret rooms behind false walls. Each mission required the ultimate act of disguise. Freddie might clasp a child's hand, whispering, "Pretend I'm your sister," as SS soldiers patrolled mere feet away. The stakes were simple. One mistake meant instant execution. They succeeded dozens of times, moving children to safety, though not every life could be saved. Bombs fell randomly, and some children died despite their efforts, a reality that hardened Freddie's resolve even as it carved grief into her heart. The three women became inseparable, a unit forged by blood, fear, and the shared understanding of the war's cruelty. They shared beds in cramped safe houses, rations that were never enough, and the grim routine of cleaning weapons after operations. Each act of sabotage, each targeted killing reinforced their bond. They survived together, planned together, and sometimes mourned together. Yet the Germans were adapting. Intelligence networks focused on reports of a girl with red hair, the intellectual assassin. Hannie Schaaf's presence elevated their profile. The Nazis were desperate, issuing orders from Berlin to capture or kill her. Hannie, recognizing the threat, altered her appearance. Hair dyed black, glasses worn, a new persona created from necessity. Still, invisibility in a city crawling with enemies was never permanent. Part 2 closes on the idea that these girls were no longer ordinary teenagers. Their city was their battlefield, their youth consumed by war, their morality tested daily. Each day demanded cunning, courage, and deception. They were assassins, saviors, and ghosts, navigating streets where danger lurked behind every corner. And yet, even in the shadows, a flicker of their humanity remained, the very thing they fought to protect in a world gone mad. By late 1944, the Netherlands had become a frozen battlefield. The southern regions had been liberated, but the north remained firmly under German control. Food was scarce. The canals froze solid, gas and electricity vanished, and darkness crept into every corner of the country. The occupiers, desperate as the Allies advanced, responded to every act of resistance with increasing cruelty. They burned supplies, executed civilians, and hunted anyone who might obstruct their rule. The winters were no longer simply cold, they were weapons. Families resorted to eating tulip bulbs and boiling potato peels to survive. Death hovered on every street, on every doorstep. For Freddie and Truus, survival was no longer a passive act. It demanded escalation. Their sabotage operations became bolder, deadlier, more precise. Explosives became their new language. Bridges, railways, and German supply lines, all became targets. They learned to read the pulse of the enemy, to anticipate patrol patterns, and to calculate the smallest error that could mean the end of their lives. Planting explosives was as much a test of nerve as it was skill. Every train derailment, every supply cache destroyed carried the risk of retaliation against nearby civilians. The girls understood this fully, yet the stakes demanded action. Inaction meant allowing the enemy to continue unchecked. One frigid night, Freddie and Truus lay on their stomachs beside a railway embankment, the snow searing their exposed skin, fingers numb from the cold, hearts pounding. Their mission: derail a train carrying tanks, ammunition, and provisions for the German military. They worked silently, carefully taping fuses and planting charges. The slightest sound would alert nearby patrols. The slightest misstep would blow them apart alongside the train. When the engine finally roared down the tracks, Freddie counted the seconds. Then, oh! The snow erupted in fire and metal, a spectacle of destruction and chaos. To the sisters it was both triumph and horror. They had stopped the enemy, but innocent civilians might pay for it in brutal retaliation. Amid this chaos, the sisters continued their humanitarian work. The deportation of Jewish children continued relentlessly. Freddie would clasp the hands of terrified children, whisper instructions, and lead them past Nazi patrols with the calm of a practiced actor. They moved dozens of children at a time, using barns, attics, and hidden rooms as temporary shelters. Yet war is indiscriminate. Air raids and patrols sometimes struck before the children could be moved. The guilt of failure, children lost despite their best efforts, was a weight Freddie carried every night. She had grown used to adrenaline, to fear, to killing. But no training could prepare her for the helplessness of seeing innocent lives snatched away. It was during these months that Hannie Schaaf, the red-haired strategist and intellectual, became the most wanted woman in the Netherlands. The Nazis circulated vague descriptions of the three sisters, but Hannie's fiery hair and daring tactics made her infamous. Every courier, every letter, every witness increased her notoriety. Reports of her exploits reached Berlin. Hitler himself was reportedly briefed. The order came from the highest levels: capture her at all costs. Hannie knew she was being hunted. She altered her appearance, blackening her hair, wearing glasses, changing her persona entirely. Yet invisibility in a city crawling with informants was nearly impossible. Despite the danger, she continued coordinating missions, guiding Freddie and Truus, and keeping the network intact. Their bond, forged in fire, blood, and shared trauma, was the only thing keeping them sane. They ate meager rations together, slept in the same cramped safe houses for warmth, and shared the grim responsibility of cleaning weapons after every operation. They were more than friends, they were family, each one responsible for the other's survival. The psychological toll of this life was immense. Freddy and Truus, now fully immersed in the work of assassins and rescuers, began to feel the strain in every moment. Memories of children they couldn't save, civilians executed in retaliation, and the faces of the men they had killed haunted their dreams. Sleep offered no relief, nightmares were constant companions. Yet the sisters pressed on. The survival of the network, the children, and their own lives depended on unwavering focus and relentless courage. They had no luxury of hesitation. Their activities, however, were becoming more visible. The German intelligence apparatus intensified its efforts. Patrols became more frequent, checkpoints more stringent. Collaborationists, men who knew the streets and the families, actively sought to betray them. The sisters had to stay one step ahead at all times. Every bicycle ride, every delivery, every clandestine meeting carried the potential for disaster. The city that had once seemed familiar was now a labyrinth of danger, where a single mistake could end everything. And yet, even amidst this terror, the sisters found moments of humanity. They laughed quietly in the shadows, shared whispered stories of life before the war, and clung to the hope that the Allies' progress would eventually reach them. They were teenagers, yes, but their lives were defined not by school, friendship, or play, but by calculated risk and relentless courage. In the frozen, bombed-out streets of Haarlem, Freddy Oversteegen and Truus Oversteegen had become something extraordinary, girls who had lost their childhood yet retained the capacity for compassion, bravery, and cunning that most adults could never comprehend. Part 3 closes on the image of the three women, Freddy, Truus, and Hanny, moving silently through the streets, bicycles carrying weapons and messages, hearts hardened by war yet still beating with a commitment to protect the innocent. Each train derailment, each hidden child, each risk taken, etched into them a reality they could never escape. The winter raged, the Germans adapted, and the girls continued to fight, not for glory, not for medals, but for life, humanity, and the hope that someday the nightmare would end. By early 1945, the Oversteegen sisters had become ghosts in their own city. Freddy and Truus moved with an almost unnatural confidence through the streets of Haarlem, their bicycles carrying not just papers or packages, but the tools of life and death. The hunger winter had transformed the city into a landscape of shadow and scarcity. Every building, every alley, every frozen canal was a potential threat. And yet, Freddy had grown to understand the rhythm of danger. She knew when to pedal fast, when to slow, when to watch and wait. Every day was a lesson in survival and cunning. The sisters' work had expanded beyond sabotage. Collaborators, men who sold out neighbors, betrayed Jews, or hunted resistance members, had become primary targets. These were not uniformed soldiers. They were familiar faces, neighbors, even friends who had turned traitor. Removing them was a delicate task. There was no room for error. Each hit required planning, observation, and, above all, courage. Freddy and Truus had perfected the art of striking unseen. One moment the target might be walking the street, confident in his perceived safety. The next he would be gone, the consequence of their skill and resolve. It was during this period that the honey trap tactic reached its full potential. The Nazis were predictable in their arrogance. They underestimated women, particularly young women. Freddy and Truus had learned to weaponize that arrogance. Taverns, cafes, and bars became hunting grounds. The sisters would sit alone, appearing vulnerable, innocent, even flustered. The men would approach, always with the assumption of conquest. And then, with perfect timing, the girls would guide the officer away from the safety of the public eye. Sometimes ambushes awaited in the shadows. Sometimes it was just Freddy, her pistol hidden beneath her coat, her heart hammering as she confronted death directly. One mission stands out in this escalation. Freddy had been assigned a high-ranking SS officer, notorious for his cruelty and efficiency. He was not a man to be caught off guard, and the streets were too dangerous for a public confrontation. Freddy, at just 19 years old, prepared herself meticulously. She dressed elegantly, fixed her hair, and walked into the tavern where he drank. Every gesture, every glance, every laugh was a calculated deception. The officer, confident and distracted by what he assumed was flirtation, followed her out into the darkness, a lethal trap disguised as a stroll. Freddy led him toward a secluded path, every step measured, every heartbeat synchronized with the rhythm of danger. At the clearing, the gun came up and the officer fell. Freddy's pulse raced, but she didn't flee immediately. She stared at the fallen man, the reality of her actions settling over her like ice. This was the cost of resistance. This was war, intimate and brutal. Yet, as they escalated their operations, the threat to Hanny Shaft grew. The red-haired strategist, despite disguises and subterfuge, could not remain invisible forever. The Nazis had placed her on the most wanted list in the country, and reports of her actions reached the highest levels in Berlin. Every courier, every witness, every intercepted communication brought the enemy closer. Hanni had become a symbol: intelligence, courage, defiance. She represented everything the Nazis despised. And then, as often happens in war, chance intervened. On March 21, 1945, Hanni Schaft was transporting a bundle of illegal newspapers, disguised with black hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She was not alone, riding with another resistance member. They approached a routine military checkpoint, expecting nothing more than a cursory inspection. But fate was cruel. A random search order sent the guards rifling through her bags. Newspapers were found, sedition confirmed, and then, hidden beneath her belongings, the pistol. Hanni Schaft was arrested. At first, the Germans did not recognize the significance of their capture. She was just another courier, another young woman involved in resistance activities. But as the days passed, the cheap black dye began to wash away. Roots revealed the unmistakable red hair that had become a legend. Shock spread through the prison administration. They had captured her, the phantom, the intellectual assassin, the face of the student resistance. Interrogation began immediately. The Nazis sought names, locations, and the identities of her associates, particularly Freddie and Truus. Hanni's capture was a devastating blow. Outside the prison walls, panic gripped the sisters. Freddie and Truus had lost their leader, their strategist, their friend. The fear was suffocating, but they could not freeze. They had to continue moving, planning, surviving. Hanni's imprisonment forced them into even greater caution. Every ride, every meeting, every mission carried the heightened risk of exposure. The war was closing in and the walls were tightening. Even as the danger escalated, the sisters refused to yield. They continued rescuing children, planting explosives, and eliminating collaborators. Their courage became a lifeline for countless innocent lives. Yet the psychological cost was immense. Freddie had become intimately acquainted with fear, with guilt, with the constant question: how much of her soul could she sacrifice to survive and protect others? Every act of resistance demanded the suppression of instinct, the control of emotion, the embracing of a reality that no teenager should ever face. Part 4 closes with the trio fractured yet unbroken. Hanni Schaft is imprisoned, Freddie and Truus remain free but hunted. The streets of Haarlem are still dangerous, the Germans desperate, the winter unforgiving. And yet, the sisters continue to move, to fight, to survive. They are no longer just teenagers, they are assassins, saviors, and legends in the making. Each day carries the weight of death, but also the possibility of saving life, a delicate balance that defines every step they take. The arrest of Hanni Schaft sent a ripple of fear through the resistance. For Freddie and Truus, it was like losing a limb. Hanni had been their leader, their strategist, the glue that held their network together. And now she was behind cold iron bars, somewhere in Amsterdam, facing the full force of the Gestapo. Every day she remained captive was a day closer to execution. The sisters knew that time was slipping away like sand through their fingers, but despair was a luxury they could not afford. They had to act. Truus, who had always been the more daring of the two, began devising a plan. It was audacious, cinematic, nearly impossible. But she had no choice. They would not sit idle while their friend faced the firing squad. Disguised as a German nurse, Truus forged papers declaring that Hanni Schaft required a specialized medical transfer. She memorized every protocol, every word, every gesture that would make her appear legitimate. Freddie accompanied her in spirit, supporting every decision, analyzing every risk, but she knew that the plan's success rested almost entirely on Truus's courage and deception. March turned into April. The days were gray, the streets silent with fear, and the winter had not yet released its grip. Truus approached the prison gates, heart pounding, carrying her forged documents and a mask of calm. She spoke confidently, pleading for the transfer, claiming Hanni was to be taken for urgent treatment. The officers hesitated. The forged papers checked out, almost. Truus played the role flawlessly, tears in her eyes, hands trembling just enough to seem genuine. Every second of hesitation could have been her last. And then the truth: Hanni had already been moved to a maximum security facility. The Gestapo had anticipated her rescue, or perhaps luck had simply turned against them. Truus's heart shattered. She had come within reach of salvation, and failed. Meanwhile, the work of the sisters continued. They could not stop. The German forces, sensing the Allies closing in, had grown desperate. Their reprisals grew more brutal. Every train derailment, every bridge blown up, risked civilian lives. Freddie and Truus operated with a precision born of necessity, but the moral weight of their actions pressed heavily upon them. They were killers, yes, but their hands also saved lives. Every Jewish child moved safely to the countryside was a victory, every collaborator eliminated a strike against tyranny. Yet the cost in sleep, in sanity, in innocence was mounting. The streets of Harlem became a maze of danger and opportunity. Freddie, with her small frame and quiet demeanor, often carried out the most delicate missions: scouting, courier work, and precision sabotage. Truus handled audacious operations, sometimes flaring out into the open to draw attention or deliver explosives. And even as Hanny languished in prison, the sisters' reputation grew. The Germans whispered about the red-haired woman and her accomplices, the young women who could appear anywhere and disappear without a trace. Their names became both fear and legend. Then came the spring of 1945. Liberation was close, but the Nazis' cruelty had not waned. On one particularly frigid morning, Freddie and Truus were moving a group of Jewish children to safety when air raid sirens screamed through the streets. Bombs fell indiscriminately. Screams echoed off the frozen buildings. The sisters pressed forward, shielding the children, navigating rubble-strewn streets. A bomb struck a nearby building. The dust and debris clouded the streets. Freddie coughed, her lungs burning, her hands trembling. She scanned desperately for the children. They were all alive, but the sight of destruction, of bodies, of ruin, was a stark reminder of the war's indiscriminate horror. Even as chaos raged, the mission to rescue Hanny became impossible. Weeks passed with no word, no hope. The sisters could only wait and continue their work, each day balancing on the knife edge of survival. Every encounter with German soldiers, every trip across the city, every mission, was shadowed by the fear that their friend was dying somewhere, alone, in a cell. Hanny Shaft had bought them time through her silence under interrogation, but the cost of her bravery was immense. And then, in mid-April, the reality of war collided with inevitability. The German forces, cornered, frantic, and knowing their defeat was imminent, began clearing prisoners. Some were released, some were moved. But the randomness of survival was brutal. Hanny Shaft was taken from her cell not for release, but for execution. The sisters did not know it yet, but the red-haired leader of their unit would face the dunes near the North Sea. The chaos of the war's final days made planning impossible, and for the first time, Freddie and Truus confronted the helplessness that had haunted them throughout the conflict. Despite this, they did not falter. Every act of sabotage, every rescue of a child, every confrontation with the enemy, continued to define them. They moved through a city teetering on the edge of liberation, shadows within shadows, balancing life and death with every pedal stroke. The world outside was collapsing, but within their small network, the principles of courage, humanity, and survival endured. They were no longer just teenage girls. They were the embodiment of resistance, living proof that ordinary people could wield extraordinary power against tyranny. Part 5 closes with Freddie and Truus, cycling through snow-laden streets, aware of the encroaching danger, haunted by the absence of Hanny, yet unbowed. The war was ending, but the toll, physical, emotional, and moral, was far from over. They had survived countless missions, killed and saved countless lives, and endured horrors that would have broken anyone else. Yet their fight was not just against the Germans, it was against despair itself, against the cruelty of fate, and against the gnawing fear that sometimes, even the bravest hearts could not save the ones they loved. April 17, 1945, dawned gray and cold over the Netherlands. The war was in its final throes, but the cruelty of the Nazis had not abated. Hanny Shaft, the red-haired strategist, the heart of the resistance trio, had been removed from her prison cell and driven in a nondescript car toward the dunes near Blockmendel. The wind off the North Sea was bitter, cutting through the thin layers of clothing she had been given. Hanny had known from the moment she was captured that her fate was not freedom. She walked with the same calm defiance that had made her the figurehead of the student resistance. Every step across the sand was a testament to her courage. In Harlem, Freddie and Truus were unaware of the exact location of their friend. Each day they scavenged information, following rumors, chasing leads, and fearing the worst. Yet they did not allow paralysis. They continued their work, guiding children to safety, sabotaging trains, and striking against collaborators. The winter had taken the country, but it had not taken their resolve. Every mission was a reminder that the war's end was near, but that survival required constant vigilance. Hanny Shaft, meanwhile, faced the dunes with a mixture of exhaustion and unyielding determination. The German officer and the Dutch trader accompanying her had no doubt she would comply, but they underestimated her spirit. She had survived interrogation, torture, and betrayal, Now, even in the shadow of execution, she would not give them the satisfaction of fear. As the first shots rang out, she fell to her knees, wounded but not broken. The wind carried the sound of the German rifle across the empty sands. And then, with a defiance that would echo for decades, she spoke words that mocked her executioners: "I shoot better than you." The Dutch traitor, enraged, moved forward with a submachine gun. Hannie Schaft did not flinch. The burst of fire silenced her, leaving her body in the sand. It was a cruel punctuation to a war fought with intelligence, bravery, and unwavering moral conviction. The dunes, littered with the bodies of hundreds of resistance fighters, became the stage of one final, senseless act of violence before liberation arrived. Back in Haarlem, Freddy and Truus only learned of Hannie's death weeks later, when mass graves were discovered. The knowledge hit them like a physical blow. Hannie had been more than a friend. She was their sister-in-arms, the one who had strategized, protected, and inspired them. The grief was nearly unbearable. Freddy, who had endured the intimate horrors of assassination and the moral torment of civilian casualties, now faced the heartbreak of losing the one person who truly understood. They mourned in silence, their world reduced to fragments of memory and loss. Despite this tragedy, the war itself was collapsing. Canadian and Allied forces swept through the Netherlands, liberating towns and cities one after another. By May 5, 1945, Canadian tanks rolled into Haarlem. Flags unfurled, orange banners flew from buildings, and the citizens poured into the streets, weeping, cheering, embracing soldiers, and celebrating survival. For most, it was the culmination of years of fear and oppression. For Freddy Overstegen, it was a bitter, hollow victory. The tanks and guns had been silenced, but the echoes of death remained in her mind. The ghostly memories of children, collaborators, and the officers she had killed haunted every street, every smile, every cheering citizen. Freddy and Truus moved through the celebrations with a strange detachment. Their survival, their accomplishments, and their sacrifices were monumental, yet the world seemed uninterested in understanding the cost. Heroes, yes, but broken, haunted, and largely invisible. Weeks passed as the reality of liberation settled over the country. Families were reunited, buildings were rebuilt, and newspapers chronicled the war's end. But few remembered the women who had fought in the shadows, who had killed, rescued, and risked everything when the stakes were highest. The political climate complicated matters further. Freddy and Truus had been raised in a communist tradition, and the Cold War was already emerging. The world wanted heroes, but only heroes whose politics aligned with the emerging Western order. Pensions, medals, and recognition were granted to some resistance members, but the Overstegens were excluded. Their files were ignored, their stories suppressed. Freddy felt the sting of this deeply. She had risked her life for her country, yet she was invisible to the very society she had saved. Sexism compounded the injustice. Society struggled to accept that teenage girls had killed, strategized, and led in ways equal to men. Their acts were sanitized, their names obscured, their humanity overlooked. Yet in private, Freddy and Truus grieved and healed together. They held on to each other as the only remaining pieces of their resistance unit. They shared memories of Hannie, of missions, of lives saved, of blood spilled, of courage tested. Freddy, who had spent her youth in perpetual danger, began to try to reclaim fragments of normal life. She married, had children, and attempted to create a world of safety and love far removed from the chaos she had endured. But the memories never faded. The war never truly ended for her. Part 6 closes with the liberation of the Netherlands, the tragic death of Hannie Schaft, and the beginning of Freddy and Truus's struggle to reconcile survival with grief. The war had ended, but the fight for recognition, for understanding, and for inner peace had just begun. The streets were free, yet the ghosts of the dunes, the woods, and the frozen rails followed Freddy wherever she went. Liberation brought victory, but also the haunting question that would follow her for decades. How do you live after killing to save lives, after witnessing horrors that can never be unseen, after losing the one person who understood everything? The war was over, but for Freddy Overstegen, the silence was louder than any bomb. The liberation of the Netherlands in May 1945 had brought celebration, flags, and cheers, yet all Freddy felt was emptiness. The streets were alive with joy, yet her mind replayed the horrors of the past 5 years. The officers she had killed, the children she had saved, the friends she had lost. Hannie Schaft, the girl with red hair, was gone, murdered just weeks before freedom arrived. Freddy felt as if a part of her soul had been buried in the sand dunes of Blockmendel along with Hannie's body. Freddy and Truus tried to adjust to civilian life, but the world they returned to had no place for teenage assassins or women who had wielded power in the shadows. Society expected them to be grateful, silent, and domesticated. Heroes, perhaps, but heroes who could never speak of their deeds. Freddie married John Decker, an engineer she had met in the post-war reconstruction effort. They had 3 children, a son Remy and 2 daughters. The act of raising a family became her sanctuary. In the quiet routines of motherhood, she tried to bury the memories of a childhood stolen by war. Cooking, cleaning, changing diapers. Life demanded mundane attention, and in that mundane she found a small peace. Yet the peace was fragile. Freddie was haunted nightly by dreams of the dead. Faces of the men she had shot in the woods appeared at her bedside, eyes accusing her, voices whispering, "Was it worth it?" Sometimes she awoke screaming, drenched in sweat, clutching the sheets as if they could keep the nightmares at bay. Truus had her own battles with memory, but she became Freddie's anchor. They met often, speaking in fragments, holding each other, sharing silences that said what words never could. They laughed quietly, remembering moments of absurdity or courage, and cried freely, grieving the friends who would never return. Recognition from the Dutch government was slow, partial, and politically complicated. The sisters had been communists, trained in the Red tradition, and the emerging Cold War made their past inconvenient. Pensions and medals went to those whose politics aligned with the new narrative. Freddie and Truus were overlooked, sidelined, pushed to the margins of history. They had risked their lives daily, killed in defense of their country, yet the nation they had saved barely acknowledged them. Even in their later years, when Truus became a sculptor and writer, publicly celebrated as part of the resistance, Freddie remained quietly in the shadows. She bore the darkness alone, enduring the irony of heroism unrecognized. Decades passed. The world changed, and slowly the historical narrative began to expand. Historians dug into records, interviewed surviving resistance members, and pieced together the roles of women in the Dutch resistance. The story of the 3 musketeers, Freddie, Truus, and Hanny, emerged as something unprecedented in Europe. A female kill team capable of assassination, sabotage, and intelligence work, functioning entirely independently in a landscape dominated by men. By the 2000s, scholars were writing about them, journalists were reporting, and the global public began to learn their names. In 2014, recognition finally came in the form Freddie had waited for her entire life. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte awarded her the Mobilization War Cross, a high military honor. Freddie, now 88 years old, sat in a wheelchair beside her sister Truus, 90, frail but dignified. Hair white, hands shaking, yet her eyes still burned with the fire of the girl who had pedaled her bicycle through the occupied streets of Haarlem at 14, carrying a gun hidden under a cloth. The medal was pinned to her chest, and the Prime Minister looked directly at her, thanking her on behalf of the nation. For her son Remy, it was the proudest moment of his life. Finally, the world saw the woman he had known only as his quiet, private mother and understood the sacrifices she had made. Yet the recognition could not erase the years of silence, the decades spent carrying the weight of her deeds alone. Freddie often spoke of it in quiet moments. "I've been in pain since 1940, she told a nurse late in life, a wry smile on her lips. She had been in pain since the moment the Nazis invaded, since the moment she realized childhood was over, since the first gunshot she fired into the street. The pain had never fully left her, but she bore it with a dignity forged in the crucible of survival. When Truus passed in 2016, Freddie felt a loneliness more profound than any she had experienced during the war. Truus had been her anchor, the sister who understood everything without question. With her death, Freddie felt the final piece of her past depart, leaving her with only memories and the stories she could finally tell to those willing to listen. In her final years, she became a custodian of history, sharing her story with journalists, historians, and younger generations who had never known the war firsthand. Her purpose shifted. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a witness to courage, a living link to the lessons of resistance, morality, and sacrifice. On September 5, 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday, Freddie Oversteegen closed her eyes for the last time. She had carried the weight of a lost childhood, of friends murdered, of moral compromises, and of silence for nearly a century. With her passing, the last witness to the 3 musketeers of the Dutch resistance was gone. But the story remained. Freddie, Truus, and Hanny had proven that courage could be found in the youngest and smallest of humans, that resistance could take many forms, and that the moral complexity of war did not diminish the humanity of those who fought with honor. Freddie had pedaled into danger at 14, a girl with braids carrying a gun in a basket. She had faced impossible choices, moral ambiguity, and the intimate horrors of killing. She had survived, hidden, mourned, and endured. She had lost friends, yet she had saved lives. She had been ignored, yet she had been remembered. Freddie Oversteegen did not lose her humanity in the war. She preserved it in every act of compassion, every risk she took to save children, and every quiet moment of dignity she maintained despite the horrors she had endured. Her story asks a question that resonates across generations. What does it mean to be human in the face of evil? Freddie's answer, forged through decades of experience and loss, is simple yet profound. Humanity is not the absence of violence. It is the courage to act, the willingness to protect others, and the strength to endure. The girl with the braids, the teenager on the bicycle, the hidden assassin of Harlem, is immortal, not in the history books alone but in the example she left behind. For those who follow, for those who remember, and for the children who now live free because she risked everything, Freddie Oversteegen's courage is a guide. Her life reminds the world that even the youngest, most overlooked and politically inconvenient fighters can shape history, change lives, and prove the enduring power of human dignity.